Late in 1944, autumn clouds hung low over Berlin as the war drew toward its final, bitter months. In Wunsdorf, a small town south of the city, the German High Command gathered in a cold, dimly lit room inside the OKW headquarters. The walls were lined with maps of Europe marked with fading lines of German control. Red pins showed Allied advances in the west, blue pins showed Soviet gains in the east. The smell of tobacco and stale coffee hung in the air. Outside, a guard's boots scraped against the frozen ground, echoing through the courtyard like a grim reminder of the world closing in. A courier entered the room, his breath visible in the chill. He carried a single folder marked with the Reich's eagle stamp. Without a word, he placed it on the table in front of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. The room fell silent. Keitel opened the folder, scanning its contents. His face, already pale, tightened as he read. He passed it to Alfred Jodl, who muttered a short curse under his breath. The paper contained intelligence reports gathered by both German agents and intercepted Allied communications. It showed in stark numbers a fact that could no longer be ignored. In the past month, American oil production had surpassed what Germany consumed in an entire year. Keitel looked up slowly. His voice was flat, almost mechanical, as he addressed the men around the table. "Gentlemen, this confirms our worst fears. The United States now produces more fuel in 30 days than the Reich uses in 12 months. Our armies cannot move without fuel. Our planes cannot fly. Our tanks cannot fight. This war, as we have been waging it, cannot continue." Guderian, standing near the map wall, clenched his fists. Known for his aggressive tank strategies, he understood better than most what fuel shortages meant. He stepped forward and tapped the Eastern Front map with a gloved finger. "On paper, we have divisions here, here, and here," he said, pointing to the remnants of panzer groups along the Vistula River. "But half of these tanks cannot move. Crews are stripping vehicles for spare parts and siphoning fuel from civilian cars just to keep a handful of machines running. The Soviets have an endless supply line stretching back to the Urals. We have nothing." The war in 1944 had turned into a logistical nightmare for Germany. Months earlier, the Allies had bombed the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, once a vital source of fuel for the Reich. Synthetic fuel plants inside Germany were under constant attack from Allied bombers. Production dropped to levels too low to sustain even basic operations. Trains were stalled. Trucks sat idle. Fighter planes remained grounded unless an emergency demanded otherwise. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was ramping up its oil production with unmatched industrial might. Massive fields in Texas and Louisiana worked day and night. Refineries operated without pause, pumping out gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. Liberty ships carried this liquid power across the ocean to supply every Allied unit in Europe. By late 1944, American forces had enough fuel not only for their own vast army but also to supply the British and even some Soviet operations. A junior officer placed another report on the table. It contained a simple graph. One line showed Germany's fuel production steadily falling since the summer. The other line showed American production soaring upward. The gap was more than a statistic. It was a death sentence for the German war effort. The men around the table stared at it, each lost in thought. The only sound was the scratching of a pencil as someone made a note in the margin. Jodl broke the silence. "The Führer still speaks of new offensives," he said, his tone heavy. "He wants another strike in the West to split the Allies. But without fuel, even a small operation will drain our last reserves." The mention of Hitler's plans brought a wave of tension through the room. Everyone knew what he meant. The Ardennes offensive, a final gamble to turn the tide. Hitler believed that if German forces could break through Allied lines and capture fuel depots, they might regain momentum. The generals knew better. Even if they succeeded in the opening days, they lacked the resources to sustain such an attack. Guderian slammed his hand on the table. "We should be preparing to defend the homeland," he said, his voice rising. "Every liter of fuel must go to defensive positions, not fantasy offensives. Our men are freezing and starving on the front lines. This," he pointed to the report again, This is the reality we face. Keitel raised a hand to calm him. Careful, he warned. The Führer will not tolerate talk of defeat. But I agree with your assessment. Our position is untenable. Outside the war room, the human cost of the shortage was plain. Tank crews used horses to tow heavy vehicles. Soldiers marched for days because trucks had no gasoline. Luftwaffe pilots waited in their cockpits for orders that never came because there wasn't enough fuel to launch their planes. Even retreat became dangerous. Units risked encirclement because they could not move fast enough to escape advancing enemies. In the west, Allied bombers roamed the skies freely. With German fighters grounded, cities and factories were reduced to rubble. In the east, Soviet armies rolled forward with relentless pressure. Their tanks never stopped, fed by endless supplies of fuel shipped by rail from deep inside Russia and supplemented by American Lend-Lease deliveries. Back in the war room, the generals knew the truth but could not speak it aloud. The Reich had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because its enemies could outproduce it on every front. Steel, oil, and sheer industrial weight had decided the outcome. Keitel folded the report and placed it back in the folder. He did not look up when he spoke again. Prepare your recommendations, he said quietly. We will meet with the Führer tomorrow. He will demand action. We will present the facts, but the decision will be his. The men rose from the table, their faces grim. Outside, the night had grown colder, and the distant sound of artillery echoed from the eastern horizon. The war was still raging, but in that room, they all knew it was already lost. The war room smelled of smoke and fatigue. Papers were stacked high, some marked with grease, others burned at the edges from a hurried rescue during an air raid. The lights flickered as power surged unevenly through the old building. A cold wind slipped through cracks in the windows, carrying with it the distant rumble of trains and the occasional low thud of anti-aircraft guns outside Berlin. A young signals officer entered, his uniform wrinkled and his boots caked with mud. He carried a folder marked, "Oil Production Urgent." The men around the table watched him cross the room. Wilhelm Keitel took the folder without a word and opened it. His fingers traced the first line, his lips tightening as he read. He pushed the papers across to Alfred Jodl, who leaned over them with a frown. Guderian, standing at the far side of the table, shifted his weight as though bracing for bad news. The report laid bare the state of Germany's fuel crisis. By mid-1944, Allied bombers had turned the Reich's synthetic fuel network into a ruin. The Ploiești oil fields in Romania, once Germany's prized source of natural crude, had been bombed repeatedly and finally seized by Soviet forces in August. With Ploiești gone, Germany relied almost entirely on synthetic fuel made from coal at plants scattered across the Reich. These plants were massive, complicated facilities that produced aviation gasoline, diesel, and lubricants. They were also easy targets. Allied bombers struck them relentlessly, reducing production to a fraction of what the Army, Navy, and Luftwaffe needed. Keitel read the figures aloud in a flat tone. 30,000 barrels a day, he said. That is all we have now. The number hung in the air like smoke. Before the war, Germany had planned for more than 5 times that amount. In 1944, with fronts collapsing on both sides, even that higher figure would not have been enough. Guderian stepped forward and stabbed his finger at the Eastern Front on the map. My armored divisions cannot move, he said. Tanks are left behind for lack of fuel. Crews march on foot while Soviet tanks roll past them. Without fuel, our panzers are nothing but steel coffins. His voice carried the raw anger of a commander forced to watch his best units rot away in fields and forests. Jodl flipped through the report, his brow furrowed. This isn't just a battlefield problem, he said. The Luftwaffe has grounded entire squadrons. Fighters sit on runways, stripped for spare parts. Our bombers cannot take off unless it is for a decisive mission, and even then only a handful are cleared for flight. The report described trains stalled on sidings for want of diesel. Trucks sat in depots, their engines cold. Supply convoys to the front lines were cut in half. Soldiers went hungry because food could not be delivered. Ammunition ran out not from lack of production, but from lack of transportation. The German war machine had become paralyzed, its weapons scattered and silent. Another officer entered carrying a separate packet. This one contained intelligence on American fuel production. He placed it next to Keitel, who opened it carefully. The difference between the two reports was stark. While Germany struggled to scrape together 30,000 barrels a day, the United States was producing more than 200,000 barrels every day, just for its military operations. This figure did not include civilian use or reserves. Texas oil fields pumped at full capacity around the clock. In Louisiana and California, new wells came online every week. Standard oil refineries worked day and night, turning crude into gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. Massive storage tanks lined the coasts, and Liberty ships steamed across the Atlantic carrying millions of gallons of fuel to ports in England and France. Once ashore, pipelines and tanker trucks moved it straight to Allied units on the front. The system was vast, modern, and untouchable by German forces. Guderian looked over Keitel's shoulder as he read the numbers. His jaw clenched. "They are drowning in fuel while we fight for every drop," he said quietly. Jodl said nothing. He didn't need to. The figures spoke for themselves. A junior clerk brought out a large chart mounted on stiff cardboard. He propped it on an easel at the end of the table. 2 lines ran across it. The first, marked with a black pencil, showed German fuel production over the course of the war. It rose sharply at first, then began to fall as Allied bombing intensified, until it dropped almost straight down by the summer of 1944. The second line, drawn in bold red, represented American production. It started high, climbed steadily, and then soared upward, dwarfing the black line entirely. The men stared at the chart in silence. It was more than numbers on paper. It was a picture of defeat. The Reich had built its military around speed and mobility. Panzers racing across open plains, aircraft striking deep behind enemy lines. All of it depended on fuel. Without it, Germany's most advanced weapons became useless. The Americans, by contrast, had built a machine that never stopped. Their production was so great that they could not only meet their own needs but also supply their allies in Britain, Canada, and even the Soviet Union. Keitel finally spoke. "This is an industrial war," he said. "We are outmatched not only on the battlefield but in the factories and refineries. The enemy's production exceeds our entire wartime consumption in a single month." His words hung over the room like a death sentence. Outside, the sound of a train whistle cut through the night. It was a freight train heading west, likely carrying the last barrels of fuel to the front. Soon even those trains would run dry. Inside the war room, the generals understood the full weight of the numbers before them. Germany's armies could still fight, but without fuel they could no longer win. The long wooden table in the war room was covered in maps. Thin lines marked rivers and roads. Small flags showed army groups. Wooden markers shaped like tanks and airplanes sat scattered across the surface. A dim bulb swung above, casting moving shadows across the table, and the pale faces gathered around it. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood at the head of the table, his uniform crisp but worn at the edges. Across from him, Heinz Guderian's jaw was set, his face red with frustration. Alfred Jodl flipped through a folder of reports, his hand shaking slightly as he read the figures. The room was tense and quiet, except for the low hum of a heater struggling against the cold November air. The door opened suddenly, and Adolf Hitler entered, flanked by aides. Everyone stood at once. Hitler waved them back to their seats and moved to the map, his eyes scanning the markers as if reading a personal code. Without a word, he picked up a black tank marker and pushed it toward the Ardennes region. His voice broke the silence. "Here," he said. "We strike here. The Allies will be caught off guard. Their lines are thin. If we break through, we can reach Antwerp and split the enemy forces. They will sue for peace." Guderian's hands tightened into fists at his sides. "My Führer," he said carefully, "we have divisions on paper, but many cannot move. There is not enough fuel for such an attack. Some tanks are already being stripped for parts. Men are marching instead of riding. Even if we break through, we cannot sustain the advance. Hitler's gaze snapped to Guderian. His voice rose. Excuses. We have succeeded before against greater odds. You lack faith in our soldiers. The Americans are soft. The British are tired. One bold move will change everything. Jodl spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. Our last reserves of fuel are already committed to defending the East. Soviet forces are pressing hard. If we divert resources to the West, the Eastern Front may collapse entirely. Hitler slammed his hand on the table. The East can wait. The Soviets will pause for winter. This offensive will decide the war. The generals exchanged glances. No one believed the Soviets would pause. Reports showed endless columns of tanks and artillery moving westward. Their supply lines were strong, their numbers overwhelming. Germany, by contrast, was crumbling. Entire panzer divisions were immobilized. Tiger tanks, once feared, now sat in forests as fixed gun positions because they lacked the fuel to move. Guderian stepped forward, his voice firm. Even if we launch this attack, how will we supply it? Every kilometer forward burns precious fuel we cannot replace. Without continuous deliveries, the offensive will stall, and our men will be trapped. Hitler turned away, staring at the map as if the lines themselves could bend to his will. We will capture Allied fuel depots, he said. Their supplies will become ours. Keitel cleared his throat, speaking with measured caution. My Führer, Allied depots are heavily guarded. Even if we take them, transporting the fuel back to our units under constant air attack will be difficult. At the mention of air attack, the room fell silent for a moment. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. Fighter squadrons were grounded because there wasn't enough aviation fuel to keep them flying. Those that did take off were outnumbered and outgunned by Allied planes. Allied bombers roamed freely, striking rail lines, bridges, and supply convoys. Without air cover, even moving supplies a few kilometers could cost men and vehicles. Guderian placed a hand on the map, pointing to a narrow corridor marked with German units. This is where we plan to advance, he said. These units here, he tapped the markers one by one, need fuel to move and we do not have it. Even retreat will be impossible if the enemy counterattacks. One of the younger staff officers, who had been silent until now, asked quietly, How will they get there, sir? He gestured at the markers. We have no fuel. The question hung in the room like smoke after a gunshot. No one answered. The truth was too plain to deny. Without fuel, the entire plan collapsed. Hitler ignored the remark and continued moving markers across the map. This attack will catch the Allies by surprise, he said, his tone sharp. We will advance quickly and crush their morale. Guderian could not hold back any longer. My Führer, this is not 1940, he said, his voice rising. Our enemies are stronger now. Their factories work day and night. They have more tanks, more planes, more everything. We are running out of men, out of weapons, and out of fuel. Hitler turned on him, his face flushed with anger. Then we must fight harder. Victory comes to those with will, not to those who count barrels of oil. Jodl stepped in, trying to calm the exchange. Perhaps a limited offensive, he suggested, focused on defending key positions and conserving our strength. A defensive strategy may buy us time. Hitler's eyes blazed. No, a defensive war is a losing war. We attack or we perish. The meeting dragged on into the night. Generals pushed markers across the map, tracing routes through the Ardennes, but each movement ended with the same question. How to move without fuel. Supply lines were already broken. Trains sat idle on bomb tracks. Horses pulled wagons where trucks once drove. Even ammunition could not reach some units. As the hour grew late, the room filled with exhaustion and despair. The generals knew the truth. The offensive was a gamble driven by desperation, not strategy. Without fuel, even success on the first day would lead to failure in the weeks that followed. Yet no one dared challenge Hitler directly. When the meeting finally ended, the markers remained scattered across the map, representing divisions that existed only in theory. Outside, the night was silent except for the distant roar of Allied bombers overhead. Inside, the men left in silence, each carrying the heavy knowledge that the plan before them could not succeed. The room was still. The papers lay scattered across the table, some marked with grease, others smudged by hands that had trembled while holding them. The faint hum of the heater filled the silence, a weak sound against the weight of the news everyone had just heard. Keitel sat rigid in his chair, staring at the map as though he could will the lines to change. His face was expressionless, but his hands gripped the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had spent his life in uniform. He had grown up believing that discipline, order, and bold action could overcome any enemy. Now he was confronted with something his training had never prepared him for: the simple fact that no amount of courage or planning could make fuel appear where none existed. Across the table, Jodl leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. He rubbed his forehead as if the act could erase the numbers on the report. The figures swam in his mind: 30,000 barrels for the entire Reich against 200,000 per day for the Americans. The gap was beyond comprehension. It was not a battlefield contest anymore. It was a slow-motion collapse of everything they had built. Guderian paced near the map, boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. His fists were clenched behind his back. Known for his fire and decisiveness, he now looked like a man cornered. He paused beside a cluster of markers representing his armored divisions. Most of them were in name only. The actual tanks sat miles away, rusting in fields, their crews trying to keep them alive without fuel or spare parts. Guderian's shoulders sagged as he stared at them. "We were built for speed," he muttered. "Now we crawl." No one responded. The weight of the truth pressed on every man in the room. Some sat slumped in their chairs, their eyes dull. For years they had told themselves that Germany's willpower and military skill could offset Allied numbers. Now that illusion was gone. The war had been decided not by daring maneuvers but by factories across the ocean, by oil fields they would never see. Keitel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "This war was lost before tonight," he said. "We just did not want to see it." His gaze stayed fixed on the table. "We taught generations of officers that leadership and training could overcome anything. But no leader, no soldier, can fight without fuel." The door opened and Hitler entered, his movements sharp and quick. The officers rose, though some did so reluctantly. Hitler walked straight to the map and began rearranging markers, his tone clipped. "We have one chance left," he declared. "The Ardennes. A strike to the west will split the Allies. It will force them to negotiate." The generals exchanged glances but said nothing. Hitler's eyes burned with a mix of anger and determination. He refused to acknowledge the reports lying in plain sight. He did not want to hear about shortages or supply lines. To him, the war was still winnable through willpower and surprise. Guderian took a step forward. "Mein Führer, these divisions cannot move without fuel," he said carefully. "Our tanks sit idle. Men march on foot. Even if we break through, we cannot hold our gains." Hitler cut him off. "We will take the enemy's fuel. Their depots will become ours. It is simple. Once we have Antwerp, their army will collapse." Jodl's voice was low but firm. "Their depots are guarded. Even if captured, moving the fuel will be impossible under Allied air power. Our own trains are barely running." Hitler's jaw tightened. "Defeatist talk," he snapped. "This is not a question of logistics. It is a question of will. I will not hear otherwise." The tension in the room grew sharp enough to cut. The generals saw reality. Hitler clung to fantasy. It was a gulf that could not be bridged. The officers lowered their eyes, unwilling to challenge him further. The argument was over, even though nothing had been resolved. Far from the war room, German soldiers lived that reality every day. In the forests near the front, tank crews stripped civilian cars of fuel, draining them dry just to move a single Tiger tank a few hundred meters. Horses pulled broken-down vehicles along muddy tracks. Soldiers marched for days to reach positions that should have been accessible by truck. The lack of movement wore them down more than enemy fire. Morale sank as they realized they were fighting a modern war with medieval means. At night, the men spoke in quiet voices around campfires. They had no illusions left. Some cursed the high command for wasting their strength. Others simply stared into the flames, too tired to speak. They knew that while they bled in the mud, across the sea their enemies had endless supplies, endless machines, endless fuel. In the skies above them, Allied bombers flew in great formations. The Luftwaffe barely rose to challenge them anymore. Ground crews rationed the last barrels of aviation fuel, deciding which missions were worth risking. Often the answer was none. German pilots sat idle, listening to the engines of enemy planes overhead, powerless to stop them. Back in Berlin, the war room stood in stark contrast to the reality at the front. Hitler pointed at maps and ordered attacks. The generals listened, their silence heavy with unspoken truths. They were soldiers, trained to obey, but obedience felt hollow when the orders could not be carried out. They knew they were sending men into battle without the means to fight. Keitel remained seated long after the meeting ended. The room emptied around him, footsteps fading down the hall. He stared at the map, but he no longer saw rivers or towns. He saw factories in America, vast oil fields pumping day and night, refineries working without pause. Across the ocean, the enemy had built a machine too large to fight. In that moment, he understood something he had never admitted before. The war was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the factories and refineries across the Atlantic, long before the first German tank ran dry. The final weeks of 1944 brought no relief for Germany. The last figures from the fuel reports made one thing clear: there would be no recovery. Without fuel, Germany's armies could not fight a modern war. Even moving troops from one position to another became a challenge. Generals who once planned sweeping maneuvers now argued over how to ration a few precious barrels of gasoline. Trains that once carried entire divisions now stood frozen on tracks, some half buried in snow, because there was no diesel to run their engines. The Reich was bleeding territory on every front, and there was nothing left to stop it. In the West, Hitler pressed ahead with his plan for a bold strike through the Ardennes. He was convinced that one decisive blow could turn the war around. His generals knew better. They understood the attack was a gamble, and its success depended on capturing Allied fuel depots along the way. The offensive began in December, under cover of fog and snow. German tanks pushed through the forest, surprising the Allied lines. For a brief moment, it looked as if Hitler's gamble might work. But as the days passed, the problem they had feared surfaced. German tanks outran their supply lines almost immediately. Crews were forced to abandon vehicles for lack of fuel. Some soldiers drained fuel from captured American jeeps just to keep moving. Others sat idle, waiting for deliveries that never came. Allied forces, with vast reserves at their disposal, regrouped quickly. Once the skies cleared, Allied planes filled the air. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages, could barely respond. Allied bombers targeted roads, bridges, and supply convoys with precision. German columns were trapped and destroyed piece by piece. By the end of the Ardennes offensive, the last reserves of German fuel were gone. The attack had achieved nothing lasting. Thousands of men and hundreds of tanks were lost. Hitler had hoped for a victory that would force the Allies to negotiate. Instead, he had burned through the final resources of his army. From that point on, Germany would never again launch a major offensive in the West. The collapse of German mobility had far-reaching consequences. In the East, Soviet forces were preparing for their winter offensive. They had learned from years of fighting and now wielded overwhelming strength. Endless trains brought supplies from deep inside Russia. American Lend-Lease trucks and fuel kept Soviet armies moving at a pace Germany could no longer match. In January 1945, the Red Army struck with crushing force. German units in the east were already weak and scattered. Without fuel, tanks could not be repositioned to counter Soviet breakthroughs. Entire formations were surrounded before they could retreat. Some units fought on foot, abandoning vehicles that had once given them speed and power. The Soviets pushed westward at an astonishing rate, liberating Warsaw and smashing through East Prussia. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing ahead of the advancing front. German soldiers were forced to fight while watching their families flee past them. In the West, Allied forces built on the success of their summer landings in Normandy. By autumn, they were advancing rapidly across France and into the Low Countries. Their supply lines stretched across the Atlantic, unbroken and secure. Convoys of fuel and equipment flowed through ports and along newly built pipelines. American and British forces could move at will, launching attacks wherever they chose. German defenders, cut off and immobile, could only react in fragments. Allied air power reached its peak. Bombers flew in vast formations over German cities, factories, and rail lines. With the Luftwaffe grounded, these raids faced little resistance. Every day, the bombing grew more destructive. Bridges collapsed, fuel depots burned, and entire industrial districts were flattened. Even basic transportation inside Germany became impossible. The civilian population suffered terribly as food shortages grew and winter deepened. The imbalance between the two sides became stark. Allied divisions had fuel for every tank, truck, and plane. German forces rationed every drop. A single Allied offensive could consume more fuel in a week than Germany produced in a month. The Wehrmacht, once known for its lightning advances, now moved slower than armies had in centuries. Without fuel, its most advanced machines were no better than static defenses. As the Allies pressed forward, German generals faced grim choices. Some units were ordered to fight to the last man, even when retreat would have saved lives. Others were left to fend for themselves when supplies failed to arrive. Communication broke down as radios went silent for lack of power. The entire command structure began to unravel under the strain. By spring of 1945, Germany's situation was hopeless. The Soviets were closing in on Berlin from the east. The Americans, British, and Canadians were crossing the Rhine from the west. There were no reserves left to shift between fronts. Even the simple act of moving ammunition to the front lines had become nearly impossible. Hitler continued to issue orders for counterattacks, but his words no longer matched reality. In the field, the picture was stark. A Tiger tank, once a symbol of fear, now sat hidden in a barn, its crew huddled inside for warmth. There was no fuel to move it. Along the roads, horses pulled wagons filled with rifles and helmets, relics of a modern army reduced to medieval transport. Soldiers marched barefoot through snow because supply trucks had been destroyed or abandoned. The Allied advance accelerated with each passing week. Every day they moved deeper into German territory, while German forces fell back in disarray. Cities that had once been key industrial centers were reduced to ruins. Rail lines lay twisted and broken. The last synthetic fuel plants were bombed beyond repair. Even Hitler's closest advisors could see that the end was near. The moment when Germany's defeat became certain had come months earlier, when the generals first read the reports about American fuel production. It was then that they understood the scale of the imbalance. The Allies were not just winning battles. They were winning the war through sheer production. America could replace every lost plane, tank, and truck, while Germany could barely keep a handful running. As Soviet forces surrounded Berlin and Allied troops crossed the Elbe, the reality was plain. Germany had lost the ability to wage modern war. The Reich, built on speed and mechanized power, had been brought to a standstill by empty fuel tanks. The war had shifted beyond strategy or tactics. It was now a matter of overwhelming resources, and Germany had none left to give. The war ended with Germany in ruins. Cities were flattened, factories silent, and rail lines twisted like broken bones. In the aftermath, historians and military leaders examined how a nation that once seemed unstoppable had been ground down. They studied battles and tactics, but again and again, they returned to a single undeniable fact. The war had been won and lost through production. The maps and strategies were important, but behind every decision lay a question of resources. Without fuel, no plan mattered. For the Allies, victory had been forged not only on the battlefield but also in the vast oil fields of Texas and the refineries along the American coasts. These industrial giants had supplied a war machine that never paused. American factories produced tanks, planes, and trucks at a pace no enemy could match. But it was the flow of fuel that kept everything moving. Liberty ships carried oceans of petroleum across the Atlantic. Pipelines were laid across England and France to feed advancing armies. The contrast with Germany was stark. The Reich had relied on a fragile network of synthetic fuel plants and captured oil fields. When Allied bombers targeted those sites, the effect rippled through every part of the German war effort. Tanks sat motionless. Aircraft never left the ground. Even basic transport for food and ammunition failed. The German army, built for speed and surprise, became a static force trapped by its own empty fuel tanks. In military schools after the war, instructors used this example to teach a hard lesson. Modern war was no longer just about bravery or clever tactics. It was about logistics on a scale so vast that even brilliant generals could not overcome it. A single statistic could tell the story. In 1 month, the United States produced more fuel than Germany consumed in a year. That figure was passed around in classrooms and lecture halls. It became shorthand for the imbalance that defined the conflict. Young officers studied diagrams of the synthetic fuel plants and the routes of Allied bombing raids. They examined shipping schedules and production charts. They learned how an attack on infrastructure could cripple an army without a direct confrontation. The lesson was clear. Control of energy meant control of war. In the years that followed, this realization shaped military planning around the world. During the Cold War, the focus shifted to nuclear weapons and global strategy, but energy remained at the heart of every decision. Armies planned not only for battles but for how to keep tanks and aircraft supplied in the field. Nations built stockpiles of oil as carefully as they built arsenals of missiles. The United States maintained its vast industrial base, knowing that its ability to produce and transport fuel was as important as its ability to fight. The Soviet Union, watching and learning, did the same. New alliances formed not just around politics but around access to resources. Oil became a tool of power as vital as armies and navies. The story of Germany's defeat spread beyond military circles. Economists and historians pointed to it as an example of how modern states rise and fall. They noted how the Reich had begun the war with daring victories but had failed to secure the means to sustain them. Captured territory gave temporary boosts, like the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, but those sources were vulnerable. Once lost, there was no backup. By contrast, the Allies fought with the knowledge that their industrial base was safe. American factories were far from enemy bombers. Oil fields were beyond reach. This security gave them time and space to build overwhelming strength. Every tank lost in battle could be replaced. Every aircraft shot down could be rebuilt. That constant renewal wore down Germany until even the most disciplined troops could no longer hold the line. Military academies used maps of late-war Germany to show how production shaped strategy. Students traced the routes of supply convoys and the locations of fuel depots. They saw how the destruction of a single refinery could ripple outward, causing delays, shortages, and eventual defeat. These case studies became as important as the great battles themselves. For the men who had sat in that war room in Wunsdorf, the memory never faded. Keitel, Jodl, and Guderian had all seen the moment when numbers on a page revealed the truth. They had realized that no act of courage, no last-minute offensive, could change what was coming. They had watched their armies fight with dwindling resources, knowing the outcome was inevitable. Their silence that night had been the silence of men who understood they were witnessing the death of their nation's hopes. Long after the war, as new conflicts arose, the lesson echoed again and again. During the Korean War, during Vietnam, and even in conflicts in the Middle East, commanders remembered Germany's failure. They planned their campaigns with fuel and supply lines in mind. Generals who had studied the Second World War understood that battles were won long before the first shots were fired, in the quiet work of factories and refineries. The image of a single chart remained powerful. It showed two lines, one falling, one rising. The black line of German production sank lower each month as Allied bombers struck. The red line of American production soared higher, carrying with it an unstoppable tide of men and machines. That chart was more than data. It was a symbol of inevitability. When people spoke of the war, they often mentioned great battles, Stalingrad, Normandy, the Ardennes. But behind those names was a quieter story, one of factories running day and night, of ships crossing oceans, of trains moving endless supplies to the front. That story shaped the world that came after. The memory of that imbalance remained a warning. Nations understood that no modern war could be fought without secure access to energy. Armies built stockpiles. Governments formed alliances to protect oil fields and shipping lanes. Every strategy began with the same question the German generals had faced too late: how to keep the engines of war running. The map in Wunsdorf, with its scattered markers and fading lines, had shown the front lines of a collapsing empire. But the real front line had been far away across the ocean, in the oil fields and factories that never stopped working. In the end, a single statistic told the entire story. One nation's monthly production had outweighed another's yearly consumption. It was not just a number. It was the measure of defeat.